A glass to the past, and the ladies cross the ages, fallen fathers from the motherland whose lives are on the pages. And the bard who said it best when he told us all the world's a stage. So fellas, grab a glass and lift your spirits to the seventh age.
Welcome one and all to the Seven Ages Audio Journal. It's time once again to pour up our glasses and pull up a chair as we gather together here in our favorite corner of the Crosstime Pub as we color in the fine details of history, and filling in the areas of all things from art to archaeology and maybe even a bit of body art. Gentlemen, how you doing?
Good evening, my friend. How are you?
I'm marvelous indeed. And you, Mr. Pintrail, the Traveler?
Oh, the landing gear is down, and I am back in my seat at the Crosstime Pub.
You're glad to be back on solid ground again, eh?
Yeah, short flight, but good trip overall, I would say.
You have spent some time in the remote and forested regions of that area known as the concrete jungle recently, huh?
Maybe even Central Park or just across from it.
So you got to see some actual trees while you were in New York then.
Yeah, actual trees, water and bridges and all the things that are lovely about Central Park. But in addition to that, just across from the park is the American Museum of Natural History. And those of you who follow us on social media may have seen some of the pictures that I posted and some of the videos I'd put up. But yeah, I got to spend pretty much an entire day there at the American Museum of Natural History. And if you've never been to that one in New York City, it is massive. You really do need a whole day, maybe even a couple days if you really want to stop and read all the placards and all the signage and all that good stuff. But it covers just about anything you could want to see in a museum if you're interested in science and history. And I tried to see just about all of it.
Man, I love natural history museums. That is my absolute favorite type of museum.
I love all kinds of museums. Naturally, I gravitate more toward, science and history kind of stuff, but art museums, I enjoy that too. And of course, anything that is an exhibit that is aimed at the specific history of an area. You know, when we've been on the road before, the Seven Ages team on our way up to Pennsylvania last fall, we're driving along and we saw a sign for a Native American site. And we thought, well, let's go check this out. And it ended up being a really great museum where there had been local collectors who had donated some of their collections to the little museum that they had. So, I mean, maybe 3 or 4 minutes off the highway on our way up through Virginia, we find this wonderful little roadside attraction that's complete with a recreated Native American museum. There had been archaeological excavations that had taken place there, and we had lithic representations going all the way back to the Paleo-Indian period with a couple of Clovis, and there was one peculiar Folsom-like looking thing in that collection too, you remember?
Yeah, it was a kind of a strange assemblage, especially for that type of site. But again, that's the beauty of getting out on the road and you never know what you're going to run into. In fact, that's what I like to do in New York City. You know, sometimes it's good to have a plan, but Saturday night, my wife and I, Crystal, we just went up to Central Park and then just worked our way down. We literally walked, I think, 40 blocks of just kind of running into whatever happens to be there. It's fun that way sometimes to just get out and explore and see what you can find.
I'm a big fan of just getting out and going and not really having a plan, although definitely knowing some of the attractions in the area you're going to visit, it's a good way to go. That's why my wonderful assistant, Lauren, is such a help, because there have been many times we've been on the road, and as we're making our way through one of these museums, I'll be getting texts from her in the basement of some, dungeon-like array of artifacts and cultural remnants from the past, and she'll be saying, by the way, Exhibit A21, you need to check this out, and then around the corner there, it's almost like that scene, I've said this before, in The Dark Knight where Batman has those special goggles and he can see around corners and everything, and he's tapping information from all the cell phones in Gotham City and everything. When we're out on the road and Lauren's back at home helping, sending information to us, I feel like that. It's almost like the gift of foresight when we're studying things that happened in hindsight. So it's really cool. I got to say, by the way, speaking of things that have happened to the past, we lost a tremendous amount, a wealth of information about our ancient heritage in Rio de Janeiro over the weekend. I'm sure you guys have seen this about the burning of the museum there.
Yeah, it was a real tragedy.
So within just hours of wrapping up my trip at the American Museum of Natural History in New York City, I see this headline. And of course, it really strikes home because we realize how much, we're talking millions of artifacts were in this museum. The museum itself was 200 years old. It's the National Museum of Brazil in Rio. It started at 7:30 that night, and it just raged all night. It doesn't look like they were able to salvage anything. As far as the artifacts, we still won't know for months what was actually lost, but it looks like right now that it was probably a total loss as far as the museum, the archives and the displays and everything. So many things to consider. The blaze itself is still under investigation, or probably will be for weeks to come. It's being said that 2 of the hydrants outside the museum were dry. That delayed efforts to get the fire out. There's all kinds of issues that seem to have been paramount in it actually going up and not being able to get under control. More than anything, I think the greatest cultural blow comes with the fact that so many of the indigenous artifacts were destroyed. All of these artifacts showed how everyone had been living in Brazil in pre-colonial times, and now all of that's lost in one building in one night. So it really makes you wonder, how do we prevent this type of thing in the future, and what other steps could be done? I've heard everything from having multiple museums, having just better infrastructure, fireproof walls, all those type of things. But it's a lot to consider when you think about what's been lost in this particular situation.
Yeah, I think one of the first issues is that this had been the former royal home there in Brazil. And again, it was a historic structure, which makes for a ideal place, you would think, to house antiquities. The problem, of course, is that it may not. I'm sure it was probably reasonably up to fire codes or close to it, but being an older structure, again, there are aspects of that construction that might have been more prone nonetheless to this kind of disaster than a modern building. And so, again, the case could be made that perhaps a modern facility that is absolutely built to code and has all these things taken into consideration would be a good way forward. One more inspiring thing, though, about this, with all that has been lost, I was looking at footage that Reuters posted online. At least some artifacts were retrieved and saved from the blaze. Again, the majority were lost, and that included Luthia, the nickname that was given to some of the oldest human remains from the Americas. And South America has afforded us a lot of very interesting ancient discoveries, especially at sites like Pedra Furada. There are some insinuations of there being stone tools and things as much as 40,000 years old. We've talked about that a bit with our own research, and of course, having never been there, again, I can't speak to the authenticity of those things. I know that Jim Adavasio, who we have featured on the program in the past and met and discussed, and we respect highly, he's authored some papers that are pretty critical of the findings at Pedra Furada. But again, that's just one of the many sites in South America from which artifacts were retrieved and were actually being featured at the museum that burned. But on a more inspiring note, there are now school children who are putting together a campaign, it was reported today, to collect photos that students had taken during their visits. And even if we've lost the actual artifacts and the heritage and that aspect of history, we at least have a photographic representation of some of the things that were lost. And so there's at very least an effort that children now are engaged in to try and document what was lost, if not in total, at very least in pictures, in pictorial form. And, there's so much about the ancient past that I think we can learn from art and from pictures. Later in the program, we're going to be talking a bit about that, and not the kind of art that you might find on the walls inside one of the ancient tombs of Egypt, or even on the rock walls at one of the famous sites like Chauvet Cave from the Neolithic era. No, what we're talking about is the art that made its way onto the bodies of ancient people. What we would know today as tattoos, and Aaron Deter-Wolf will join us to talk about what I think is truly the enduring mystery of ancient body art, how it was done, what tools were used, and why people did it. But again, looking at what happened in Rio de Janeiro, it's just all the more important that we understand things about history, because when tragedy strikes, you never know what you might lose.
On Sunday, when I first saw this story about the museum, first I thought of you guys, because I knew you were going to, we were going to talk about the story. But the thing that really kind of struck me about it was it's sort of a very similar to the loss of the library at Alexandria.
Yeah.
This building been there for 200 years. It's a great idea that the school children had about the photos, because they may not even know what all they lost. There was so much history in this place.
Well, I said this actually on one of my other podcasts, and I want to give credit to a longtime friend of mine, Lauren Coleman, who had tweeted about it. And he and Darren Naish, another friend in the zoological community, are the two that I saw talking about the burning initially. And that's exactly what I said too, James. I actually tweeted and said that, much like the loss of the library at Alexandria, there's, as far as history goes and preservation of it, probably nothing worse than the loss of so much knowledge in one place at one time like this. And many of us, I think, were looking at this and the fact that much of that information is irretrievable. And so, again, one benefit of the modern digital age is the fact that not only are we able to document what we have in visual capacities, but when something is lost, God forbid, at least we do have a visual representation of that, which is more than we have in terms of what history has hinted might have been kept in the library at Alexandria. And I'll say this too really quickly also. The idea that there are things in museums and the idea that we don't know always even what all we have. Think of all the numerous discoveries that are made when something has been filed or cataloged in a museum, but it hasn't been identified or it might have been mislabeled. Often things are discovered and it's decades before someone goes and they actually find the drawer it was put in, and then they do a proper analysis and say, oh my, this is a new species, a new fossil. Or maybe this is something that was identified as this, and it turns out to be a totally different species. This has happened within the last couple of years, at the Smithsonian. So again, that's part of the problem, is that although we will have at least some record of the things that were on display in the museum at Rio de Janeiro, the problem is that with most of these museums, there was probably far more than what has been accounted for, and some things that were lost may not have been identified. So there is a chance that we don't know all the things that might have been destroyed in the blaze at Rio de Janeiro, at least. And this is maybe the one fortunate thing that we've heard about the entire situation, apart from the effort by the children to try and document things that were lost. At least there wasn't a tremendous loss of life. And I understand that most, if not all, of the security were able to get out of the facility. But it's a tragedy, really, any way that you look at it. I want to really quickly go over to the listener emails here before we get to our interview with Mr. Aaron Deter-Wolf. David writes into us and says, "Dear Dr. Hanks, I'm not a doctor, by the way. I only play one on the radio. But he says, I thoroughly enjoy your shows and enjoy them with great relish. I appreciate that your perspective balances rational thought with Fortiana." And for those who aren't familiar with what that term means, it's a general term that is derived from the name of Charles Hoy Fort, who's a man who in the early 20th century cataloged things that were somewhat anomalous to science. He was not without fault, and on this podcast, we devoted an entire episode to the work of William R. Corliss, who was far more scientifically minded, as I know my comrades and I both aspire to be. Science and skepticism are paramount, I think, when studying things about the sciences, but there are definitely questions that remain unanswered, and an open mind at times is also requisite. So he says, it's unique, refreshing, and challenges me to re-examine my own ideas and beliefs, the tone that we take. I appreciate that. He says, while listening to the Seven Ages podcast from 6/16/18, there was a brief discussion of blended beverages made with Guinness. Now, some of the blends sounded intriguing, but the bone of contention I found was with one of the blends called the Black and Tan. He said the name may be a little offensive to some folk from the Emerald Isle or those whose ancestors came from there. The name Black and Tan comes from the uniforms of Englishmen recruited into a regiment comprised of the lowest of the low that aided the military occupation of Ireland during the early decades of the 20th century. They were armed and had little or no oversight or supervision. Needless to say, the Black and Tans were despised by most Irish populace. This is to say that you might not want to order or extol the virtues of the Black and Tan blend if you happen to be visiting Ayr or a pub in the Irish diaspora. It could save you from having to remove egg from your face. I hope you avoid this little cultural snag in your adventures in time and space, and I enjoy the programs and hope that you avoid any timeline where you need more than your sonic screwdriver to make your escape from an Irish pub. Well, thank you, David, for writing in, and he signs off as the Omniversal Anarchist. So good to hear from you, David, and thank you again for bringing that to our attention. Again, we wouldn't want egg on our face in an Irish pub.
That's a very interesting little historical tidbit there that I'm going to commit to memory because I want to pull it out in the pub, and it's even more interesting than the drink, I would have to say.
That's right. And I'll say also in general practice that I think you guys would probably agree. Blending Guinness with anything is less than ideal. Guinness served straight up, that's the preferred way and the way I intend to order it. And I think that, all discussion of history aside, it would be a travesty to walk into an Irish pub and order a Guinness with anything in it but the Guinness itself. So thank you again, David, for writing and bringing that to our attention, and also tying in the historical parallel, understanding history so that we can better understand each other. But again, as we've already kind of teased, guys, one thing that I think is kind of left out of some of the history books in a way, and something that we're really striving to understand, is what role did body art play in ancient times? What were the tools that were used to inscribe art onto ancient bodies, like Otzi the Iceman, for instance? And the expert who joins us here after the break, Aaron Deter-Wolf, has actually contributed to studies of the Iceman and many other instances of ancient body art throughout history. It is the 7 Ages Audio Journal. Aaron Deter-Wolf is an adjunct professor at Middle Tennessee State University who currently works with the Tennessee Division of Archaeology. He earned his bachelor's degree from Duke University in 1998 and his MA from Tulane University in 2000, where he studied Mesoamerican archaeology. Between 1995 and 1999, he conducted fieldwork in Central America with teams from Williams College and the Belize Valley Archaeological Project, including excavations at 2 previously uninvestigated late classic Maya sites in Guatemala. Aaron's MA thesis examined the late classic ceramic figurine assemblage from the site of Motul de San José in Guatemala's department of Petén. And since that time, he has worked on numerous archaeological projects with academic and federal organizations. But fundamental to what we want to talk with him about this evening has to do with a project he has now been undertaking for the past decade, and that involves tattooing. This ancient form of body art was practiced by many prehistoric and historic societies, including the ancient Egyptians and Nubians. Egypt, for example, boasts iconographic and physical evidence for tattooing for a period spanning at least 4,000 years, which is the longest known history of tattooing in the world. Now, Aaron has been involved in research aimed at identifying ancient tattooing implements through a combination of contextual analysis and microscopic use where. In 2009, he organized the first American academic symposium to examine ancient and early historic Native American tattooing, which culminated in the volume Drawing with Great Needles, Ancient Tattoo Traditions of North America. Since that time, he has participated in international symposiums devoted to ancient body modification and authored several book chapters on the identification of tattoo tools with the archaeological origins of tattooing. In 2016, Aaron was the lead author on an article in the Journal of Archaeological Science reports confirming that the European Iceman Otzi exhibits the world's oldest preserved tattoos, and that same year appeared in the Nova documentary Iceman Reborn, discussing Otzi's tattoos. Now, along with Lars Krutok, Aaron is co-editor of the new volume Ancient Ink, The Archaeology of Tattooing, the first ever book dedicated to the global archaeological study of tattooing. So we have, I think, really one of the world's foremost experts here with us tonight. Welcome to the program, Aaron Deter-Wolf.
Hey, guys. Thank you for having me. You lay all that out there. It makes me sound awfully fancy. I'm pleased you guys are interested in the topic.
We couldn't be more interested. And again, it sounds like you have worked literally all over the world and with specimens from different parts of antiquity and the ancient world. So I think we're going to get quite an overview tonight.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Aaron, I first ran across your work by a general search, and then I began to see how much you'd actually done on the topic. And it really sparked my interest. And we had basically discussed one of your earlier articles that appeared in the spring 2018 issue of American Archaeology magazine. And that's where I first became familiar with the level and degree to which you've been researching this topic. And it wasn't until really reading that article and then looking into your other work since then that I've understood just how much we may be missing by overlooking the art of tattooing throughout ancient civilization. So to begin the conversation, I'd like to kick it off with understanding the art of tattooing as it pertains to ancient civilizations. Why is it important that we know about this, and what is it that we may be missing as far as the overall anthropological approach to different civilizations?
Yeah, so what really got me interested in this topic is probably over a decade ago, and was sitting around at lunch on an archaeological survey. Everybody's sitting on their screens and eating lunch and comparing new tattoos. And many archaeologists have tattoos that are pieces of ancient art or ceramic designs that they found or things like this. And in talking about this with my colleagues, we sort of came to this sudden realization that, there's this record of people being tattooed in antiquity. If you look back to the historical accounts of the European explorers in the Age of Discovery, if you look back to the visual accounts that accompany those voyages, if you go back into the iconographic record, going in as far back as the cave art of the Upper Paleolithic in Europe, you see people with marked bodies. And we don't know exactly what those markings are in a lot of cases, right? If you see a figurine with lines incised onto it, that may be depicting clothing, it might be depicting scarification, it might be tattooing or something altogether different. But in sitting around at lunch that day, we realized that, collectively we had close to a century of archaeological experience sitting around that lunch table. And none of us had ever identified something in the archaeological record that we could call a tattoo implement. And so that just really struck me, right? This idea that, we're confronted with this pictorial and textual evidence that this practice existed, and talking at this point solely about North America, but that in, dozens and dozens of excavations, hundreds and thousands of archaeological identifications, all these collections all over museums and private collections, and all of the scholarship being done, that as of that point, there had been maybe fewer than a dozen cases where people had gone out on a limb and said, I think this artifact is a tattoo implement. And, that's a huge blank spot in our vision of the past then. If we can accept that people were doing this, even sporadically, even if we say they're just doing it occasionally, then why aren't we finding the tools? And in thinking about it, the conclusion that I came to is that we're not finding those tools because we're overlooking them, we're calling them the wrong things, or there's a bias involved, right? Until very recently, not nearly as much of America and of the Western scholars were tattooed. This is, kind of an emerging trend in our society today. And I think until fairly recently, people just weren't interested in studying tattooing as being a valid art form, or as recognizing how integral it was to indigenous cultures, both living and cultures of the past. And then you sort of take that idea, right? And I spent a couple of years looking at this in North America specifically, but then found that this same concept applies broadly to the global study of archaeology. That outside of Polynesia, outside of the Pacific Islands, there have been very, very few archaeological identifications of tattoo implements until the last 5 to 6 years. And so this says to me as an archaeologist that I'm entirely missing something that's really important to how these people live their lives. And this, I think, sort of cuts to the bone of what archaeology can do wrong. Right? What we're trying to do is learn about how people lived in the past, about how they interacted with one another and interpreted their world, and trying to learn about them as humans. But when we reduce ourselves to these pure functional typologies, when we get into, we get blinded by stone tools, we get blinded by picking up bone implements and calling them awls. And once you call something a bone awl, that's all it's ever going to be, because that's what's in your artifact catalog. That's what's on the museum label. And it's very hard to go back later then and say, well, what about if all of these tools that we've identified for decades now are actually something entirely different? And so that's sort of been the thrust of all of this over the years, is just sort of building up this idea and trying to get out into the literature and into the sort of collective mind that we should be looking at other things. We should be looking outside of our classic Western typologies and considering when artifacts might be more significant to the people that made them or used them, or when they might be related specifically to body art, body decoration, and tattooing particularly.
Yeah, those are all fantastic points and all that we want to get into here. But backing up just a little bit, I can't help but wonder when we're looking at these ancient civilizations, these cultures, and like you said, you made the point of only, what they leave behind, the stone implements, the bone implements, things like that, the tangible things that we can pick up and study. And that's all we're left with, where there's so much, basketry and fabrics and things like tattooing that aren't always there for us to study. So I can't help but wonder, when we're considering tattooing and its importance throughout ancient civilization, Is it just now at this time in history that people are really beginning to consider tattooing as an intricate part of these different civilizations' culture? But, have they just overlooked that in the past, or maybe not even considered it until this point in time in history?
I think that's largely correct. If you go back into the 1600s, the 1700s, you have these depictions by very early archaeologists, let's call them antiquarians, looking particularly in South America, where they illustrate tattooed mummies coming out of the sands of South America at these sites that they visit. Going back even earlier than that, these records are not hidden in the 15th and 16th and 17th century literature, in the depictions and the chronicles of the European explorers. They very clearly describe and illustrate tattooing on the bodies of indigenous people all around the world. And I think really what has been happening is that people have known that this was here, but really weren't inclined culturally to consider it as being important. And in some cases it's acknowledged, in some cases it's just overlooked. I think a great example of this is if you think about museum dioramas, right? Those fantastic reproductions with, the life-size or partly life-size figures, people dressed in the costumes of ancient cultures or civilizations going about their daily lives. These sorts of things that I think when we were younger, particularly, that was a big part of museums, was the sort of cultural diorama. Rarely, if ever, would you see tattooed bodies in those museum displays. And again, that's not something that was hidden. It just wasn't something that was considered important, or wasn't considered important enough to include in these discussions of these societies. And that's something that's been really interesting to watch over the last decade, is how that has been changing. There are now many museums that include, by default, images of tattooed bodies from the past and from indigenous societies. Cahokia Mounds Museum across the river from St. Louis now has tattooing as a integral and very important part of their exhibition on Native American life. And so I think that's a really great example of how we're seeing this shift in recent years.
Aaron, could it also be that maybe at points in the distant past, tattooing actually was the norm? I mean, we know that the Italians did it in the Neolithic Bronze Age. We know that Peru's Mocha culture also engaged in this, and the Egyptians as well. On the whole, it seems that further back, many people did it, but that perhaps somewhere along the way, things like religious stigmas and other kinds of cultural barriers maybe lessened the proliferation of tattooing as a cultural kind of a practice, and maybe we lost it along the way, and now it's coming back into fruition. Could that be the kind of a scenario that we're looking at as well?
I think that's absolutely the case. I think that the very specific Judeo-Christian, Greco-Roman cultural history of tattooing then, filtered through Elizabethan England, through Victorian Europe, through modern social stigmas. There's no doubt that tattooing has always been around, and in fact was practiced by our own societies and societies to which we trace our cultural heritage. But as a result of these very specific histories involved, in the West, tattooing has tended to be regarded as something that is not aspirational. And again, this is all very, very much changing over the past, let's say, 30 years or so, coming out of the second tattoo renaissance.
Yeah.
But up until that time, it was mainstream society would tend to look down on it. Now, at the same time, it's always been there, and this is one of these funny things. My colleague Matt Loader has looked into this, and he's found newspaper or media headlines basically from every generation going back to the 1800s, and every one of them says basically the same thing, which is tattooing is not just for soldiers and sailors anymore. It's now being worn by fill in the blank.
Yeah.
Most recently soccer moms and college students and things like that. But the fact that newspapers keep reprinting that story every generation since the 1800s, shows you that it's always been there. It's just not been broadly accepted as part of our cultural milieu. And I think that's one of the things that's really dramatically changing now around us. Yeah,
the continual republication of that idea in different article formats also seems to say that some of those stigmas are lingering and that we're still kind of coming around to this subject. And, it reminds me, speaking of stigmas, of something else. In the archaeological community, there has been this long-held idea that people in the ancient past certainly didn't use watercraft more than maybe 8,000 years ago or so. As we're beginning to find certain migrations would seem impossible if it had not been for the fact that ancient people used watercraft. Now, what does this have to do with tattoos? Well, the question I have is, the reason we didn't find evidence of the watercraft is because these were perishable technologies. Now, you'd mentioned looking at things like awls, which are essentially a little bone implement used to pierce holes in something like leather or hide. What if we had certain perishable technologies that were used for the tattooing art? Could it be that certain things were lost to time in that way? Or does that seem unlikely by virtue of the processes required in order to actually effectively implement tattooing in the first place?
No, that's absolutely possible. If you look at the broad global sample of tattoo implements, in many cultures you see things like thorns being used to tattoo. There's no one universal type of tattoo implement. Some places are using bone, some places are using shell, some places, well, of course, after the introduction of steel needles, that's rapidly adopted. That's one of the issues with looking at tattooing archaeologically, is that steel needles so quickly and so effectively replace indigenous tattoo technologies once they're introduced by Europeans, that there's virtually no written record of what was being used prior to that. And so that's part of the detective work, is trying to figure out what those other things were. But, depending on where you go, bone is a perishable artifact type,
sure,
right? Depending on soil chemistry, bones may not survive. Depending on soil chemistry, you may end up with nothing left but stone tools. And so that's one of the big issues, right? In addition to the fact that we have a limited sample of tattooed physical remains in the form of naturally and deliberately mummified individuals, we also have a very limited sample in the form of tools. Now, my belief is that there are more tools out there than we know of. We just haven't identified them correctly yet. And part of that has been these use-where studies that I've been working on, is trying to figure out how we can go back and look at old tools, at things already that have been collected and recorded and cataloged, and look at them with fresh eyes and get past those old typologies.
Yeah.
Aaron, one thing that I haven't seen written about or heard anybody talk about is, what kind of pigment did they use to actually create the tattoos without, I guess, essentially without poisoning yourself? What could you use for that in the natural environment?
Well, so again, broadly from the global sample, carbon-based ink is the most popular tattoo pigment. The specific form of carbon varies depending on the region and the raw materials. Sometimes it's lamp black, right? It's uncombusted carbon from a seal oil lamp. It could be in the Arctic. On the Great Plains, they're using specific species of woods and grasses that are being burned to create carbon and charcoal. And then that is then pulverized in a mano and metate, a mortar and pestle, and then diluted in a liquid, in a carrier. And that is India ink, basically. It's the same thing that we use today when you're learning how to do calligraphy. And today, black tattoo ink is basically that same mixture. It is a carbon-based pigment in a diluent. And that's pretty much what we use now. Now, across the world, then, there are additives that get put into that. Depending on the culture in question, they will add specific ingredients that may not be intended to affect the color, but that have symbolic or ritual significance to them. So, some of the things that are widely quoted as being used are things like gallbladder from a tiger, right? Or in Southeast Asia, the chin fat from a corpse in one case is included. In the Sakyant tradition, the exfoliated skin of a particularly revered spiritual leader, a particularly spiritual monk, would be included into that mixture. And the idea is that, these things, these powerful substances, are being put into your body. So it's not just the final image that's significant, but it's the ingredients that are going into your body. It's the ritual around putting those things in, the songs that are sung, the performances that take place. It's the time in your life at which these things are being done. This is a whole multi-layered sandwich of symbolism from just beginning to end that I think is hard sometimes for people today to grasp, because we live in this society in which we have free choice to get pretty much any tattoo we want pretty much anywhere on our body, right? We can pick an artist, we can pick a design, we can pay that person as much or as little as they demand, and we can have that thing done tomorrow. And for most societies across the world, throughout the scope of history, that was not the case. These were things that were earned by virtue of who you were in the society. They were things that were conferred upon you. And And if you got them illicitly or unfairly, there were severe consequences for that.
That's super interesting, but I got to level with you. I feel like the chin fat from a corpse may cause a rash, maybe.
Well, that's a really interesting thing, right? So we of course have very strong, health code regulations and things when we think about people being tattooed. But as you guys were saying a minute ago, it seems almost as though most people in the past may have been tattooed if you really get down to the nuts and bolts of the thing.
Huh. Okay.
And that was done without 20th century sterilization, without Western medicine. It was done in environments that we would not consider to be safe or sterile. And yet people lived through it in droves, apparently. And so, part of this is because in traditional societies, the people giving the tattoos are ritual practitioners. They're shaman, they're medicine men, they're old women that are healers. And so the same people that are taking care of the healing, of the giving, helping babies enter the world, those same individuals are doing the tattooing. So there is that kind of medical control to it, right? The person that knows what they're doing is doing the tattooing, the person who knows about healthcare. But, all of these other things, the human body's amazingly resilient. I think in many cases, these things, they might cause a rash, but, probably the fact that you were gaining the spiritual power of that particular monk may have offset the fact that it was itchy for a little while, right?
Very good points. We talk about why they got the tattoos, and I do want to come back around to that here in a minute. But being that we're on the topic of the implements themselves, Aaron, in your research, what are we finding as evidence of the tattoo implement itself? What are they using to actually put it in, and how do you go about determining that when you're looking at an archaeological site?
Sure. Yeah. So the tools that are used vary widely depending on region and depending on culture. And some of it is cultural, and some of it relates to the environment, what tools are available to them, what raw materials are available to them. One of the issues that I've had in studying ancient Native American tattooing is that there are no written or pictorial accounts of this practice from earlier than about the 1600s. And so we have to sort of extrapolate based on the historical record. We have to sort of build that chain of evidence going back into the past. Ultimately, that only gets us so far, right? There are a lot of pointy things in the archaeological record, and any one of those pointy things could pierce the skin. And that's really all you have to do to give a tattoo, is be able to break the skin. It can be as gnarly. I mean, it can be really horrible in the end, right? Think about jailhouse tattoos. You can tattoo with a ballpoint pen. Yeah, it doesn't mean it's going to be pleasant, but you can do it. But so how well a thing breaks the skin might or might not be a factor in figuring these things out. One of these ways that we've been looking at this recently has been the idea of microwear or use wear. This is the idea that when a tool is used for something, it develops a distinctive wear pattern. And this even happens today with your kitchen knives, right? Kitchen knives that are used to cut meat will have a different polish develop on them than kitchen knives that are used to cut vegetables, than kitchen knives that you take out and say, chop down a tree with, right? And the same thing applies to stone tools or bone tools or really anything. You can pick up a bone tool, and based on the microscopic wear patterns, you can tell, was it used to punch through fiber for making basketry or clothes, or was it used to push through dry hide for leatherworking, or fresh hide, for example, in tanning or curing of hides. And so those sorts of things, that those use-wear properties are really cool because they give us an objective look at how these tools were used, right? It divorces our own opinions, our own sort of biases from the process. And you can look at this tool and say, oh, well, that was used definitively to work leather, or this one over here was used specifically to cut plants. And so this sort of helps us look at things that have been conventionally identified as tattooing implements and question that. And a great example of this, are you guys familiar with the Hopewell bladelets at all?
Yeah.
Yeah, so informally, this has been rarely published, but informally for decades now, people have said that tattooing was probably one of the function of these Hopewell bladelets, of these small stone blades. And that's a fine idea on its face. But we have more and more use-wear studies of these things that are being published now, and none of those use-wear studies are consistent with tattooing. They're consistent in some cases with butchering meat, but not with very shallowly slicing wet or fresh hide.
Right.
And so that gives us a new sort of line of evidence to look at those artifacts and say, well, maybe, but thus far we can't back that up.
Yeah, you got to go with what's most likely, and that's the thing is you mentioned the bladelets, and when we talk about microblades and unusual lithic types, Jason blew my mind some time ago when we began looking at the Clovis crescents, that you find out west.
Yeah,
we look at these things and we have ideas about what the applications might have been, but that's all primarily speculation. And trying to look at something like tattooing, where the end result ends up on the ultimate perishable technology, the human body, and trying to trace this after thousands of years, and yet there is good evidence that people were doing it. I mean, taking it all the way back to Paleo-Indian times, what is the evidence that maybe tattooing was something that even people that far back would have been practicing in North America?
Well, so here in North America, the direct evidence is frankly lacking. There have been a couple of identifications of possible Paleo-Indian tattoo implements from North America. One of which Al Goodyear identified at the Topper site in the Time Team America video where they visited the site. It was a Chert Graver. And the other one is from Heinz Cave in Texas. Do you guys know that site?
Jason?
It's
I'm not familiar with that one, I don't think.
Okay, it's a dry cave site in Texas. It's kind of late Pleistocene, very, very early Holocene. Mm-hmm. But it has this incredible perishable technology assortment from it. The folks up at Mercyhurst in Pennsylvania have those materials. Anyway, there's a sharpened antler tine that's set in a basket weave sleeve, a woven sleeve, mm-hmm. that they identified initially as a possible scarifier, and then later on have said sort of informally that perhaps this was used for tattooing as well. If you step back more broadly, what's the possible contextual evidence for tattooing in the Paleo-Indian times? Well, we know they're using pigment, right? We don't have great evidence for rock art particularly, but we know that they are using specifically ochre in a ritual fashion to decorate blades, to decorate landscapes, and possibly to decorate bodies. Mm-hmm. Are they inserting it into their skin permanently? Definitely, maybe. Right? This is actually one of these really fun questions about tattooing is, I like to frame it is it ceramics or is it fire? Right? Is it something that is so deeply rooted in the history of our species that it goes back to the first Homo sapiens sapiens and is carried with our ancestors out of Africa, like fire? Or is it something like ceramics that is integral to our human condition in a different way, that all of these groups in different places at different times independently invented this technology, independently invented this practice to fulfill a similar need in their societies? And that's something we just can't answer at this point. I'd like to think that it's very, very ancient. I think that probably tattooing came into North America along with the first Paleo-Indian people to cross that bridge, to cross the Bering Land Bridge, or to come in on watercraft. But can I prove it? No, I can't prove it.
Aaron, that's very interesting you say that about the different groups coming to the same types of technology or the same types of implements separately over time. Because I've had that theory for a long time that given, human beings and everything else being equal and enough time to go by, people will come up with similar types of technologies and build similar types of things in cultures that are completely unrelated to each other.
And we see some evidence of that too, James. I mean, if you look at some of the actual architectural innovations, both in the New World and the Old World, presumably these things had to have been occurring, if not at the same time, independently of one another, unless, of course, we get into questions about ancient diffusion, which maybe is beyond the scope of the present conversation. But I think that a case could be made that there are those kind of simultaneous, or at very least independent technological innovations like that.
Yeah, certainly.
I think it speaks to this idea that there are certain things that are just hardwired into us as humans. Right. Maybe that's four-sided buildings. Maybe it's the idea of putting, something that's important on top of the mound as opposed to at the bottom of the mound. Maybe it's related somehow to the way our fingers function. Going back to the early manufacture of hand axes and things like this. But I think there are these sorts of global and cross-cultural things that humans have come to over time. And it's exciting to think that, tattooing might be one of those. I mean, certainly you just look at body decoration as a concept, right? I mean, we are really the only animals that do this for cultural reasons. Other animals out there decorate their bodies in different ways, but not the ways that humans do. And, we use beauty, we use body decoration as a proxy for behavioral modernity, right? When people start talking about the Middle Stone Age and the appearance of the first Homo sapiens sapiens, behaviorally modern humans, the things that they tick off on that list are, beads and blades and bone tools and fish hooks and use of pigments. And a lot of that is related to the improvement or alteration of the human body, which is fascinating.
Boy, isn't it?
Yeah, it really is. Aaron, I do have a question about something. We were talking about the red ochre, and I know that on the Anzac barrel, it appeared to be part of that Clovis burial, as well as many across the world. And again, we see red ochres used so many times in cultures all across the planet, not just here in North America. Again, it seems to be one of those things that is universal, if you will, for burial practices or whatever it may be implemented before, but it seems to be out there in almost all of the cultures. In any of the implements that you've looked at, or that any of the others that's been researched, has there been any type of blood residue analysis done on the bone or the stone to see if it is human blood that's present or other animals? Has any type of research been done concerning blood residue?
Not with the stuff that I've been working on. There are some instances where that has been done. Last year, the year before, there was a publication of some obsidian tools from Oceania that date to about 3,000 years old, I think. And they did do some residue testing, some blood residue testing on them, and say that they got good results on that for human hemoglobin. There are also some cactus spines out of Coahuila, out of northern Mexico, that I know of that have been tested for human antiserum and have come back positive. I have not done that, in part because I don't have the funding for that. Residue analysis is something that's expensive and still kind of controversial depending on who you talk to. And so with where I am and the funding that I have available to me, that's just not been something that we've been able to undertake yet. There's a lot of discussions we can have about how far back in the archaeological record could you reliably find antisera, right? And questions about, when you do this testing, oftentimes people tend to find that, this tool was used to butcher an entire Paleolithic zoo, right? Like the results seem too good to be true in many cases. So yeah, it's something that probably needs to be done and needs to be addressed more fully, but I'd like to see more controlled experimentation on that sort of thing before we just start, shipping artifacts all around.
Oh yeah, completely understandable, and I understand your points there for sure. Something that I kind of want to get into at this point is, again, we've touched on this so far a little bit here and there, but let's get into the uses, the cultural value itself of the actual tattoos. So I can't help but kind of associate this with the Mississippian cultures, because here we see, massive mound building. We begin to see a caste system in play. We have chiefdoms and different things are beginning to line up in a ranking system, if you will. And I can't help but imagine that tattoos would have been a very important part of that. The chiefs may have been tattooed in a certain way. The medicine men may have been tattooed in a certain way. Your affiliation with a regional tribe or a family line, all of those could have been indicators for different tattoos. So I know this will get into a bit of speculation, but that's always good for conversation. What are your thoughts on Mississippian chiefdoms or even woodland civilizations? How would tattoos have been important to those civilizations and cultures?
Well, for me, the best way to address this is to use that comparative ethnography, right? Is to look at the historical record of why modern and historic Native Americans were tattooing. And then to, as is reasonable, project those back into the past and see if we can identify some of those same themes then in the archaeological record or in ancient societies. And so when you look at these societies historically, there's definitely these things that you're talking about the signaling social difference, elevating certain individuals, marking certain marks are reserved for certain individuals because of what they've done, or in some cases because of what their families have done. So, for example, men were oftentimes tattooed in certain ways with certain patterns to mark their accomplishments in raids or on the field of battle. Women might be marked because of the accomplishments of their husbands or their fathers. That's just one aspect of it. There's also then these practices of marking people to usher them into adulthood. A lot of the tattooing rituals took place at moments that were accompanied by naming ceremonies or things people think of as vision quests. These moments where people became full-fledged members of the society, and they weren't full-fledged members until they had received their name, until they had received their vision, or until they had received their tattoo as part of that. And again, we think about, vision quests. That's something, a lot of people have heard about that in movies and popular culture, and, growing up, you heard about that sort of thing. But very rarely did we hear that, oh, well, one of the things that happened was you found your guardian spirit, your Manitou, and then when you got back, you shared that with the shaman who tattooed the Manitou on you to give you a connection to it, right? And so that's a part of these things that are going on. And so when we look back at the Mississippian art, particularly, there are some strong connections between marks on Mississippian bodies in the iconographic record and historic tattoo traditions, particularly from the Great Plains. And so what we tend to do then is to use those marks from the Great Plains and try to figure out, well, since these were being given for the following reasons, then probably the Mississippians were being tattooed for those same reasons. And it's, there are as many reasons for this as there are stars in the sky, right? Every culture is a little different. Every culture has their own marks, their own ceremonies, their own significance that they attribute to it. And, it's hard to sort of drill down to that one thing. A tattoo could be given to mark adulthood, but then the symbols themselves connect that individual with a powerful guardian spirit. That guardian spirit's unique to their individual society, so it also marks them as being a part of this one specific society. They could pass that guardian spirit down to their children, who might also be marked with it. There are all of these different sort of layers to the thing.
Wow. Guys, we normally on this show say dig deeper, but I think tonight we need to say think ink. We're talking with Aaron Deter-Wolf. He's an adjunct professor at Middle Tennessee State University. And again, he also works currently with the Tennessee Division of Archaeology. Aaron, something that's definitely been on my mind throughout this conversation is when we look at ancient cultures and societies, not all of them, of course, had written language, but at least going back to Sumer and generally the cultures that sprang to life, there in the Fertile Crescent, Mesopotamia, Egypt, etc. We begin to see language and we begin to see art that gives us a fair representation of their lifestyle. So do we see in ancient historic cultures and their art and their writings where it was available, do we see evidence of tattooing and how it might have been implemented by those cultures?
Okay, yeah. So we may. Is the answer. We are increasingly learning about this thing. One of the issues, of course, is that today we use the word tattoo, which is introduced to the European lexicon from Captain Cook's voyages through Polynesia. But before that point, going back into deep history, there are all kinds of different words that people use to describe tattooing, both in European language and in indigenous languages all over the world. And so one of the many sort of detective techniques that you have to use when looking at this question is what words were they using to refer to tattoo? There's been a case made, for example, that in the Holy Land that the word stigma, or the root of the word stigma, stig, may have actually referred to tattooing at some point.
Interesting. Rather
than the stigmata that we think of in the Christian sense. That it was related to, the root of the word relates to the prick or the sting of a snake bite, and that may be referencing in some cases tattooing, particularly in Greco-Roman sources. So that's that sort of thing that we have to get into. Now, one of the things that's really interesting is that it's very rare in ancient art for them to show people being tattooed.
Right.
You see the final result, but hardly, if ever, do you see the process being undertaken. And so what that means is they weren't polite enough to leave us pictures of the tools they were using. And so that, again, we are then left without that direct line of evidence. We sort of have to extrapolate from there.
Yeah, well, it's very interesting because, there is so much of the ancient way of life that we do have record of, from dancing people to, again, their mythic representations of therianthropic gods, half-human hybrids, all kinds of things,
Right.
which obviously stem from the imagination. So you'd think that the more real-world aspects of life there would be a representation of, and yet we don't see that much of it. Perhaps the best art that actually survives, which indicates that people were doing tattoos in the ancient world, are the tattoos themselves. So that's a big question. Let's look at some of the instances where we actually have people whose remains have been preserved well enough that we can actually see not only that they had tattoos, but what kind of tattoos they had and what that meant to their society and culture.
Yeah, so I recently put out this open source database. It was generated out of the project several years ago where we looked for I did a project with several colleagues in which we determined that Ötzi the Iceman from Italy and Austria, from the Alps there, was the oldest tattooed human mummy. But in doing so, we had to look that up. We had to double check. And so we ended up with this database of all of these other mummies. And we ended up including it in that original article as a table. And since then, I've sort of been updating it as I found new sources and turned it into this tattooed human mummy database that's open source and online. And it's pretty remarkable how many are out there. And in some cases, there are entries in that table that may refer to dozens or hundreds of individuals. Particularly in South America, you run into these historical accounts where someone will say, based on the tattoos seen in the mummies laying on the surface, it would appear to me that at least 30% of the ancient population was tattooed. We have no idea how many mummies they were seeing. The necropolis of Anson in Peru, it kind of seems like in the 1800s and early 1900s that everybody who visited there was maybe taking a tattooed mummy part home with them as a souvenir. There's all of these things all over the world, and some of them are in collections that are private and so are inaccessible, and some of them are in public collections, but then some of them we haven't seen yet, even though they may be on display. And this is this fantastic story of evolving technology, this discovery last year or the year before of these pre-dynastic mummies from Egypt that are tattooed. And these are from the site of Gebelin, and they've been on display in the British Museum for nearly a century. But it wasn't until someone took an infrared camera and shown it on these mummies that we could see that they were in fact tattooed. And so I think we're going to see a lot of that going forward. People are going to start using that technology on mummified human remains and are going to start finding far more tattoos in the ancient world than we ever knew were there previously.
But that is really fascinating. So just to be clear on a couple of things here, what you're saying is that infrared technology revealed the presence of tattoos where over time they may have at very least left the realm of the visible, and we didn't realize that some of the mummies that we actually have on hand bore tattoos. And so the likelihood of there being more ancient remains with tattoos is increased slightly with this technology, right?
Oh, I think increased dramatically, yeah. Okay. So as human flesh mummifies, depending on the conditions, the epidermis will oftentimes darken. It will become darker, and as that happens, tattoos on the surface may become obscured. Now, of course, Ötzi the Iceman, that was not the case. The day they pulled him out of the ice, they could see the lines on his skin. Wow. But in other instances, these things have become invisible to the naked eye. Well, infrared technology is great, right? So infrared wavelengths will reflect differently off carbon-based ink, for example, than they will off the untattooed human epidermis. And so because of those differences in the way the wavelengths reflect, a camera with an infrared sensor in it can pick up those tattoos that might otherwise be invisible. And this was actually how they found what may be the last set of tattoos on Ötzi the Iceman in 2016, was they used these different wavelengths, these different technologies to do non-destructive imaging, and found a tattoo on him in a location that had been hidden in part by darkening of the skin and in part by the way the skin had rolled over on itself. But with the right technology, they could see it.
Yeah, really quickly, Jason, I know you got another question, but I think that we should really expose, at least where it won't be damaging, when it comes to archaeology, a lot of different things should probably be exposed to different wavelengths of light, because, James, I know you'll probably be able to speak to this. When we're looking at different stratigraphic layers, we use different kinds of light in order to better illuminate different layers in stratigraphy, right?
Yeah, certainly. And there's different minerals and different mineral assemblages in soils and soil horizons and even, partially lithified soil. Yeah. So there's all types of applications for that, and I could see how that would be very useful in examination of artifacts.
Yeah, I mean, and of course with regard to revealing tattoos, because again, we're looking at so many new technological innovations that are showing the unseen to us from the ancient past. I'm sorry, Aaron, go ahead.
Well, no, I was just going to say, one of the interesting things about this, this is not a new technique, right? Art historians have been using infrared reflectology for years to look for underpainting or earlier paintings that were painted over. But it's really the progression of technology to where we can now do it in a non-destructive manner.
Correct.
Infrared radiation is heat radiation. And so particularly some of the very early mummies that were looked at using infrared light, they're not in great shape anymore because they were incidentally kind of cooked along the way. Yeah. And now we can do that with LEDs, which generate no heat and are completely non-destructive. And not only that, we can do it with consumer electronics, right? We can have this on a camera that you can carry with you in your pocket into the British Museum. It's not even a matter of setting up this giant tripod or pulling the mummy out of display and putting it into a special storage container anymore. We can do all these kinds of things on the fly now, and that's pretty remarkable.
Absolutely is.
Aaron, part of the conversation I think that is really important to consider here is, in the modern day, tattooing has become wildly popular, and you can find some of the most fantastic artists all over the world. I mean, the art itself today is phenomenal. But when we look back in time, there's, again, that traditional style of tattooing that we've discussed. In the modern day, many people will go out of their way, go great lengths, travel long distances to be tattooed by a traditionalist in the traditional way. What are your thoughts on the modern day interpretation of traditional tattooing? And does it seem to relay someone trying to connect with that original ritual, or does it seem to have a more modern and updated premise to it when someone's going out of their way to get tattooed in the traditional style?
Well, so for starters, I should go ahead and acknowledge that a couple years ago, I took a trip to Indonesia that did involve me sitting down for about 8 hours and being tattooed hand tap style by an artist named Durga. So I have to cop to that to begin with. But I think it varies depending on the artist and depending on the individual getting it done, right? So art is one of these fantastic things where as people look forward, we tend to look back for inspiration and to understand where the history has come from, to gain insight about what it is that we do now. And tattooing, I think, is that same way. Some of the people who have been the most interested in these discussions about like archaeological techniques and indigenous societies around the world are contemporary tattooists, because they want to know about the history of their profession. Now, some of them are themselves from indigenous cultures. And this has been a really powerful thing where indigenous artists, particularly in North America, are reclaiming techniques and motifs that were part of their cultural milieu that were lost or almost lost to colonial forces, to acculturative forces over time. And those things are now coming back. And so you have people that are doing fantastic work in the American Arctic doing skin stitch tattooing for Inuk women. And you have Native American artists who are doing traditional Native American designs using hand poke methods in the Pacific Northwest or in the Eastern Woodlands. And so it's amazing to see that kind of thing going on. Now, of course, it's not just indigenous artists that are using these styles and techniques. There's also, Western artists who are doing hand tapped or skin stitch tattooing. And the designs that they're doing are, in the very least, inspired by those historical and indigenous designs. I personally would prefer that the designs be inspired by rather than that they be literal representations of. I think, if you to put this in terms of modern tattooing, you don't want to steal a tattooist design, right? You want a fresh work. You don't want to just pull something off Instagram and go to your local guy and be like, hey, this guy in New York did this design, give it to me. Right? That's kind of stealing. It's not great. Well, in that same way, these are sacred symbols. If you weren't Catholic, you probably wouldn't take communion, right? So if you're not Dayak, you maybe don't want to get the Borneo rose tattooed on your shoulders, right? These are parts of these cultures that have been challenged or have been threatened because of colonialism. And so being aware of that, I think, is very, very important.
Yeah, it certainly is. I guess we're kind of winding things down here. I guess you are an advocate of tattooing in the modern sense, although you're one of those rare instances, Aaron, where you can say that getting tattoos is a choice related to your profession, as you've already kind of outlined. I want to talk to you just about this in terms of modern tattooing and the art and the kind of culture that's associated with it, because I know a lot of our listeners out there probably have tattoos and are probably fans of people who do. We have magazines that are dedicated to this. And again, there's very much a culture around it. It seems to be coming more into vogue again. And obviously in the ancient world, that was already the case probably long ago in different parts of the world. So were you a person, did you have tattoos before you got involved in the archaeological study of tattooing?
I did, and I've continued to acquire them since then. I have a mix of modern electric machine work that are personal things about me and my family, and then I have things that are experiential. Getting hand tapped was a big thing for me to experience. It was powerful both emotionally and mark a particular point in my life, but then also to experience that style. It gives you a better understanding of what people would go through to get full body black work, for example, in the ancient past. Now, at the same time, I've also then given myself a couple tattoos related to my research, which is kind of been an odd thing. I didn't really see it going down that track, but in looking at these microscopic use wear patterns, we tend to study this by using pigskin. Mm-hmm. Pigskin is very similar to human skin, but that just wasn't good enough for you, was it? Well, but it begs the question, right? Is dead pig skin the same as live human skin when it comes to microscopic wear patterns? Sure. And reasonably, we could say yes, but no one had actually done that yet. And so someone had to do it, and I say, hey, all right, I'm right-handed, and my left wrist looks pretty good. It's a place I can work with, and so now I have lines on my left wrist that match Otzi's left wrist. How'd it turn out? They turned out great. It's a single point white-tailed deer needle, using modern black tattoo ink, and there's about 1,500 punctures for each line across the wrist. You had to go back over it 2 or 3 times to really sort of fill it in and make it stick. And if you look at it closely, it's not a clean line. It's not a modern electric line by any stretch of the imagination, but it gives you this sort of feeling for what it takes to sit down and undergo that then. Yeah, absolutely. Folks, you hear about donating your body to science. That usually occurs after one passes from this mortal realm. Aaron, I think you are a cut above the rest. You did it in this life, donating at least a portion of your body to science, although you got to keep it, and now you got this beautiful art to show it too. Hey, you appeared in a Nova documentary about Otzi the Iceman and his tattoos. Can people purchase that online? That is an excellent question. I believe so. It's at least it's done through Nova, I believe. Mm-hmm. And so it should be available via your local PBS station, depending on their interface. But the DVD is also for sale, I believe. And you're co-editor of a new volume called Ancient Ink, The Archaeology of Tattooing. Where can folks find that online if they'd like to purchase a copy? That is widely available online. It's through the University of Washington Press and can be ordered directly from their website. It's also on Amazon and any other online bookstore. And the big takeaway from folks, if they want to understand tattooing as it relates anthropologically and otherwise to humans, you look at the past, you look at the present, you have experienced tattooing and you've inflicted this on yourself. You've, I think we can all say, taken great pains to understand tattoos. What's the big takeaway? The big takeaway for me is that this is just one aspect we were completely blind to as archaeologists until pretty recently. That makes me wonder what else there is out there to find, that there's more to learn, both about this particular subject area and about the ancient past as a whole. I think we need to, be very careful to not impose our own viewpoints onto the past, and instead to let the artifacts and let the people of the past speak through the archaeological record.
Fantastic interview by Aaron. I think that's a really important topic to consider when we're looking at the archaeology of all the various cultures here in North America, Central and South America. Tattooing is as popular then, I believe, as it is now. It's an intricate part of the overall story. If you'd like to hear more from Aaron Deter-Wolf, he will be appearing at the second annual John W. Sanders Lecture. He's going to be talking about the life, death, and tattoos of Otzi the Iceman. This is going to be happening September 15th at Fort Lewis College, Durango, Colorado, 7 p.m. in the Student Union Ballroom at FLC 1000 Rim Drive. So if you happen to be in the area, stop by for the lecture and show some support for Aaron and his research. Also, if you have a tattoo story of your own that you want to share with us here at 7 Ages, you can write us at James, Micah, or Jason at 7ages.org. Also, you can follow us on all social media, Twitter, YouTube, and Facebook.
Excellent. Well, guys, I tell you, it's about time for a coffee.
Yeah, you got a coffee emergency going, don't you?
That's right, yeah. In the Crosstime Pub, we normally drink other kinds of dark beverages, but I've got a 4 a.m. flight to catch as I head up to Regina, Saskatchewan, come home for another day on Monday or Tuesday, and then I'm headed out to Wyoming. It's that time of the year where I'm doing a lot of travel, but I'll hope to take a camera along and document my journeys. Who knows, maybe we'll see some more wonderful footage of something on our Instagram, which of course Jason was putting up while he was in New York over the weekend. And that of course is 7 Ages Research on Instagram. You can find us, just do a search for 7 Ages Research and you'll find us on YouTube. And of course the number 7 Ages Research on Twitter, you'll find us as well. And don't forget Facebook, where it's also 7 Ages Research, you guessed it. So pretty easy to find us in all the different formats online. We'd love to be able to interact with you, hear from you. And of course, maybe you guys in writing to us can contribute to something that will be featured on a future edition of the podcast. So fellas, yes, indeed, I think maybe I've got time for just one more pint and then I'll go to the store and get the coffee. How's that sound?
Priorities.
All right, fellas, it's good times as always. And thanks to all you who tune in and listen to our program and support it each week. Head over to 7ages.org. If you like what we do, you can even drop us a donation with the PayPal button right there on the right-hand side of the page. Support the ongoing efforts of our historical surveys. I'm Micah Hanks, he is Jason Pintrail, and James Waldo, the geologist, and it is the 7 Ages Audio Journal.